What's up, cool people? I'm Matt Conroy. Welcome back to our Bible study. Okay, so yeah, kicking off Deuteronomy. We left things off basically with it seemed like the Israelites were ready to cross the Jordan River and go into the Promised Land. We'll see how events unfold. Because, I mean, Moses is still alive throughout most, if not all, of Deuteronomy. So there's still quite a bit of reading to do before they actually fully go there. But, yeah. I don't want to spend too long introducing it. I'd rather just kind of hop right into things. And maybe if I have relevant thoughts for context and whatnot, I'll leave those as I, start reading through. So, here we go. Deuteronomy, chapter 1. These are the words that Moses spoke to all the people of Israel while they were in the wilderness east of the Jordan River. They were camped in the Jordan Valley near Suf, between Paran on one side and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab on the other. Or Dizahab, I don't know. Footnote there at Jordan Valley, Hebrew says Arabah, which doesn't necessarily mean too much to us. If you don't know that much about Hebrew, it's just kind of another name. There are some times when I wish I knew some Hebrew just to kind of be able to give a little more insight into that. But anyway, obviously it's going to be the Jordan Valley because it's, valley areas near the Jordan River, as opposed to the somewhat unlevel terrain in some of the surrounding areas. So this was, lower elevation. But, yeah, so they were on the east side of the Jordan River where they needed to cross over it to get into Canaan, a.k.a. the Promised Land, which is where Abraham had lived before. But because of the famine and having to go down to Egypt, they weren't there anymore, and they were making their way back. Okay, so then verse 2. Normally it takes only 11 days to travel from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, going by way of Mount Seir. But 40 years after the Israelites left Egypt, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses addressed the people of Israel, telling them everything the Lord had commanded him to say. This took place after he had defeated King Sihon of the Amorites, who ruled in Heshbon, and at Edrei had defeated King Og of Bashan, who ruled in Ashtaroth. While the Israelites were in the land of Moab, east of the Jordan River, Moses carefully explained the Lord's instructions as follows. We'll get to that in a bit. So yeah, the land of the Moabites, the Amorites, and where King Og of Bashan, those were kingdoms and people groups that they had already fought and conquered, basically, on the east side of the Jordan River. And with the land being near a river and pretty decent for livestock, so it seemed, some of the tribes already had kind of said they wanted to settle in that area, but, the fighting men of those tribes still had to cross the river to go help the rest of the tribes get the land that was promised to them in Canaan. Also, finding it interesting that it outright says, normally it only takes 11 days to travel from Mount Sinai to basically where they ended up, or at least roughly near there. Or at least I assume that's where Kadesh Barnea was. Because why else would it mention specifically that? So, yeah. In a span of distance that really would have only taken 11 days normally to walk by foot for a large group of people, because of them, in a way, refusing to enter the Promised Land the first time around because they were too scared, they wound up wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. Basically so that most, if not all, the people who were too scared to go in would then die off, and a newer, hopefully more faithful, or at least more courageous generation would then take their place and actually go into the Promised Land and conquer it and settle it. Footnote there at Mount Sinai. Hebrew word is Horeb, which is another name. It was actually, I think it actually used that name when Moses went there, like, after he had fled Egypt for fear of being killed, and went to what we typically read as Mount Sinai. I think that first time around, like when he saw the burning bush and whatnot, it called it Mount Horeb. I could be wrong on that, though. But they're both the same mountain anyway. Also, footnote there at 11th month. Hebrew says in the 40th year on the first day of the 11th month. Oh, gotcha. Rather than saying 40 years after they left Egypt, it just says in the 40th year. Okay, anyway. This day in the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar occurred in January or February. So, yeah. Even though to them it was the 11th month, I mean, their 11th month was relative to Passover and whatnot, because right around that time is when their year starts, or at least started. So yeah, right around January or February, it seems, is when this was happening within the calendar year, in case you're interested in that. But, so anyway, all that just as an introduction to what Moses is going to tell the people. And I've probably dwelt on that long enough. I have plenty of chapter to go, so maybe a little less giving my thoughts and explaining things. Alrighty, so here we go. Verse 6. And this is Moses speaking here. When we were at Mount Sinai, the Lord our God said to us, "You have stayed at this mountain long enough. It is time to break camp and move on. Go to the hill country of the Amorites and to all the neighboring regions, the Jordan Valley, the hill country, the western foothills, the Negev, and the coastal plain. Go to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, and all the way to the great Euphrates River. Look, I am giving all this land to you. Go in and occupy it, for it is the land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to all their descendants." And once again, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did in fact live in Canaan. So now their descendants, roughly 400 years later, are now going back there, because that was the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants. It wasn't just that they would, be a large group of people. It was that they would be a large group of people living in that land. At least mostly in that land. Debatable about some of the tribes living on the other side of the Jordan River, but anyway. Although it does mention the Jordan Valley here as if it's part of that broader promised land area, so I guess it counts. Footnote there at foothills. Hebrews says the Shephelah, or Shephelah. Verse 9. Moses continued, "At that time I told you, you are too great a burden for me to carry all by myself. The Lord your God has increased your population, making you as numerous as the stars. And may the Lord, the God of your ancestors, multiply you 1,000 times more, and bless you as he promised. But you are such a heavy load to carry. How can I deal with all your problems and bickering? Choose some well-respected men from each tribe, who are known for their wisdom and understanding, and I will appoint them as your leaders." Again, this was back at Mount Sinai. Verse 6 said, when we were at Mount Sinai, and he still hasn't mentioned leaving there. I find it interesting that he feels the need to recap what was said there, but again, in context, this should be like a whole new generation that he's speaking to, who maybe could use some refreshers on these things. But it also seems to be kind of like, once again, going back and recapping other things that happened that might be helpful for the younger generation to know, so maybe they can learn from prior mistakes. But he words it as if, like he's using you in this as if it's the same people. I think that's more so just because, like, it's the same people group. But anyway. Okay, verse 14. Then you responded, "Your plan is a good one. So I took the wise and respected men you had selected from your tribes and appointed them to serve as judges and officials over you. Some were responsible for 1,000 people, some for 100, some for 50, and some for 10. At that time I instructed the judges, you must hear the cases of your fellow Israelites and the foreigners living among you. Be perfectly fair in your decisions and impartial in your judgments. Hear the cases of those who are poor as well as those who are rich. Don't be afraid of anyone's anger, for the decision you make is God's decision. Bring me any cases that are too difficult for you, and I will handle them. At that time I gave you instructions about everything you were to do." So, again, kind of going back, because, it was a large group of people. I mean, the first counting or whatever of just the fighting forces was over 600,000 men. Never mind the women and children and others who would not be fit for battle. And we also found out that at the second, counting census thing, whatever you want to call it, that they still had similar numbers. So, yeah, no duh, he needed some other people to help him oversee the disputes and other affairs of the people. And then there was also, a lot of the laws that were given at that time before they had really fully left Mount Sinai. Then we get to verse 19. Then, just as the Lord our God commanded us, we left Mount Sinai and traveled through the great and terrifying wilderness, as you yourselves remember, and headed toward the hill country of the Amorites. When we arrived at Kadesh Barnea, I said to you, you have now reached the hill country of the Amorites that the Lord our God is giving us. Look, he has placed the land in front of you. Go and occupy it as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has promised you. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. But you all came to me and said, first let's send out scouts to explore the land for us. They will advise us on the best route to take and which towns we should enter. This seemed like a good idea to me, so I chose 12 scouts, one from each of your tribes. They headed for the hill country and came to the valley of Eshcol and explored it. They picked some of its fruit and brought it back to us, and they reported, the land the Lord our God has given us is indeed a good land. But, I'll get to the but in a minute. But, so yeah, again, this is kind of recapping stuff, almost as if he would be telling a group of people, hey, so, remember all this stuff that happened? Almost like he's about to say, all right, all this stuff happened, and then I'm also going to give you this bit of advice or wisdom or instruction or something. But there's a lot to cover regarding the previous events. So, you know, it might be a while before he expands on that much further. So Kadesh Barnea was in the hill country of the Amorites, which was, I believe, sort of the first people group that they fought and conquered. But, like, they were still kind of outside of that when they sent the spies in, or scouts or whatever. So that, I guess, because of that being sort of the edge of the broader promised land, is why it mentioned Kadesh Barnea specifically in the first verse or two. You know, I guess it was verse 2, because it was talking about the length of the journey and how long it would normally have taken, but, you know, because of their unfaithfulness, they wandered around for 40 years instead. But anyway, so they reached the edge of the promised land, sent some scouts ahead who brought back some of the fruit and said that, yes, it's a good land. And then we get to verse 26. But you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God and refused to go in. You complained in your tents and said, the Lord must hate us. That's why he has brought us here from Egypt, to hand us over to the Amorites to be slaughtered. Where can we go? Our brothers have demoralized us with their report. They tell us, the people of the land are taller and more powerful than we are, and their towns are large, with walls rising high into the sky. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. But I said to you, don't be shocked or afraid of them. The Lord your God is going ahead of you. He will fight for you, just as you saw him do in Egypt. And you saw how the Lord your God cared for you all along the way as you traveled through the wilderness, just as a father cares for his child. Now he has brought you to this place. So, the report from the scouts was, yes, it's a good land. There's a lot of good, plant life, fruit, food, whatever. Like, it's a good place to live in, but the people there are scary, man. They're big and tall. We saw giants, and they've got like these big walls around their towns. How are we supposed to, be able to defeat these people? So, basically, while they recognized that the land was good, they chickened out. And, despite, Moses is saying that he told them not to be afraid, but it wasn't just him. It was also Aaron and Joshua and Caleb. But still, they were in the minority of the leaders in this case, I guess. So, that gets us to verse 32. But even after all he did, you refused to trust the Lord your God, who goes before you, looking for the best places to camp, guiding you with a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. When the Lord heard your complaining, he became very angry, so he solemnly swore, "Not one of you from this wicked generation will live to see the good land I swore to give your ancestors, except Caleb son of Jephunneh. He will see this land because he has followed the Lord completely. I will give to him and his descendants some of the very land he explored during his scouting mission." So, interesting it doesn't mention Joshua there, because Joshua and Caleb kind of scouted together and both gave an overall favorable report. But it's going to mention Joshua later as I look ahead, so maybe that's why. But yeah, it seems odd to us that after all this stuff that they went through and the ways that God provided for them, that they still didn't trust God. Again, they chickened out. They thought that God wasn't big enough to handle these people that they would have had to fight. Which they might not have even really had to fight that much or that hard if they had had God's blessing and, let him go before them to these cities. But anyway, verse 37. And the Lord was also angry with me because of you. He said to me, "Moses, not even you will enter the promised land. Instead, your assistant Joshua son of Nun will lead the people into the land. Encourage him, for he will lead Israel as they take possession of it. I will give the land to your little ones, your innocent children. You were afraid they would be captured, but they will be the ones who occupy it. As for you, turn around now and go on back through the wilderness toward the Red Sea." So, yeah, I guess it wasn't necessary to mention Joshua in there with Caleb, because now it's, God saying that Joshua is going to lead the people into the promised land instead of Moses. Of course, Moses is not mentioning right here the way that he was a bit disobedient to God. But, I don't know, maybe he left it out because that wasn't necessary, per se, for the people to know. Because honestly, some of what had caused the distrust and the issues along the way was not only a distrust or a lack of faith in God, but also a distrust of Moses, specifically, and his leadership. So, maybe bringing up more of his faults would only, call things further into question in the overall situation. Also, footnote at Red Sea, Hebrews says Sea of Reeds. That's, again, just different way of referring to the same place. We all would know of it as the Red Sea, at least, related to the situation. That's just maybe not what they called it back then. Anyway, not a big deal. So, verse 41, and I'll probably just read through to the end. Then you confessed, "We have sinned against the Lord. We will go into the land and fight for it, as the Lord our God has commanded us." So your men strapped on their weapons, thinking it would be easy to attack the hill country. But the Lord told me to tell you, "Do not attack, for I am not with you. If you go ahead on your own, you will be crushed by your enemies." This is what I told you, but you would not listen. Instead, you again rebelled against the Lord's command, and arrogantly went into the hill country to fight. But the Amorites who lived there came out against you like a swarm of bees. They chased and battered you all the way from Seir to Hormah. Then you returned and wept before the Lord, but he refused to listen. So you stayed there at Kadesh for a long time. And again, this is all just like Moses giving a recap of things, as if he's going to say something more and add to it later. I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but really the book of Deuteronomy is pretty much just like Moses' final words to the people before they go into the promised land, since he's not going with them. But yeah, so initially they were too scared to go into the promised land. Then God was upset with them because of that. And then they realized that they were wrong, but they thought they could just go into the promised land anyway, as if they would still have God's blessing. They clearly did not, because they got pushed back, defeated rather handily, it seems. So, yeah, really in thinking they were going to do what God wanted, after God had said it wasn't going to happen, they disobeyed God again, making the situation even worse, essentially. So, I guess that wraps it up for Deuteronomy chapter 1. Again, I think this is all... I think the majority, at least, of the book of Deuteronomy is kind of like Moses' final words to the people. So, for right now, he's recapping things just to then kind of bring it back around and say, okay, here's the final bit of instruction, encouragement, advice, and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's it for now. Okay, so it seems like we're kind of getting a recap from Moses on the events of leaving Egypt and traveling through the wilderness and whatnot. And I assume this is him giving this recap to the younger generation, which has now grown older, of the Israelites before they go into the promised land. I also am kind of assuming that the recap is going to be sort of a precursor to some other instructions and or advice, that kind of thing, before they go to the promised land. Specifically, crossing the Jordan River into Canaan. But anyway, we'll see how long the recap takes and where all he goes with it from here. But, as always, like and share if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to the channel, click the bell to get updates when I post new videos. Look down in the description to get info on other social media pages and all that good stuff. And leave comments down below there with any thoughts you have. So that's it for now. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you for the next video. But until then, stay cool, people.